2 scientists from Washington arrive in the Arctic for an investigation. Another scientist who arrived earlier that day shows them the investigation site. A Russian oil team discovered something there. They arrive at the crash site of an old, huge aircraft. Another team of scientists is already there, investigating the object. The scientists are able to make a hole in its hull, and the 2 men from Washington enter the vehicle. They start looking around and exploring the vehicle, which they are not familiar with. Deep within it, they uncover a shield frozen solid in a block of ice. It is March 1942, and the Germans are attacking Tonsberg, Norway. A church boy hurriedly enters the church and blocks the door with a plank. The local priest sees him rushing and walks up to him. Suddenly, the German soldiers, led by Lieutenant General Johann Schmidt, ram a tank through the old church and uncover an ancient tomb protected by the priest. Schmidt confronts the priest about an ancient weapon. He says that what Schmidt is looking for is just a legend, but he does not believe the priest one bit. Schmidt uncovers the tomb within the church and finds a core holding a cube object that is meant to be the Tesseract, an ancient relic that is said to be from Odin's weapons room, which possesses unimaginable power. He drops it on the stone floor, shattering it into thousands of pieces. He knows that an object of power would not be buried in a simple tomb. Schmidt threatens the priest's cooperation, saying that he could save his village if he works with. The priest subtly directs him to the carving of Yggdrasil on the wall. Schmidt approaches the carving and discovers a hidden mechanism that opens a secret compartment. Inside it is a small wooden box containing the real Tesseract. He commands his soldiers to open fire, and he shoots the priest in the chest before he and his men leave the church. In New York City, Steve Rogers is sitting in line, trying to enlist in the military. The doctor calls him for his physical examination, but when sees his terrible history of health issues, as well as his obviously weak physique, he rejects him. Steve tries talking his way through, pleading with the doctor to get him enlisted. But the doctor thinks that it is best for him not to join the military. Steve decides to go to a cinema after his rejection. People are watching a video of the war effort before the actual movie starts. One man in particular does not seem to care and complains about how it is delaying the movie. Steve calls him out, and the man does not like that. They bring their fight outside, and the man starts throwing hard punches at Steve until he stumbles on trash cans in the corner of an alley. Steve cannot react fast enough, causing him to get hit several times more, but he keeps on standing back up. Steve tries throwing a punch, but being bigger than him, the man easily blocks it and prepares to punch him again. However, before he can land it again on Steve, Sergeant James Bucky Barnes arrives and stops him. The man tries punching him, but Bucky easily stops him and punches him, chasing him away. Bucky sees Steve's rejected enlistment form and casually asks him how many times he already tried. It turns out, Steve has been faking his identity every time he gets rejected for military enlistment, just so he can enlist again. The officials have noticed this and sent Bucky in for the case. Steve is a little surprised that Bucky got the order. Bucky tells him that he is in the 107th Squad and he will be on his way to England tomorrow. The 2 of them decide to celebrate their last night together for a while by attending an exhibit on future technology. Bucky set up a date for the 2 of them to enjoy the night. The 4 of them head to the main hall, where Howard Stark presents his latest creation, an anti-gravity car. On the center stage as the audience watches in awe. Steve sees another recruitment building and sneaks away from Bucky and their dates. Bucky eventually finds him and discourages him from enlisting after being rejected so many times. Steve argues that it is not only about him, but for the service of their country. Dr. Abraham Erskine overhears their argument and is interested in Steve. They drop their argument, but Bucky warns him not to do anything stupid. They hug each other and say their temporary farewell to each other. Steve continues his enlistment and is currently waiting in the examination room. A nurse enters and informs the doctor assigned to the room about Dr. Erskine. The doctor tells Steve to wait as the 2 leave the room. This confuses Steve, but a few seconds later, Dr. Erskine enters the room and introduces himself as the representative of the Strategic Scientific Reserve. He confronts Steve about his goal and his several failures in enlistment. Steve tells him that he would not really like to shoot anyone. He thinks that he has lost his chance to enlist once more, but the doctor gives him a chance and recruits him. In a hidden facility in the snowy mountain, Schmidt and Dr. Arnim Zola are trying to harness the power of the Tesseract. Dr. Zola created a machine that they can use to transfer and utilize the power of the ancient artifact. He voices his doubts to Schmidt, but Schmidt's eagerness makes him ignore the doctor as he takes out the Tesseract. They incorporate it into their machine and put it to full power. The machine breaks down, but they are able to utilize the power it can provide. With more adjustments, this newfound power could change the tide of the war and the course of the whole world. Steve is reporting for his first day as a recruit in the military training grounds. Agent Peggy Carter is supervising all the operations division. One soldier starts mocking and flirting with her because of her accent and because he has no respect for women. Agent Carter immediately puts him in his place by breaking his nose on the first day. Colonel Chester Phillips arrives and introduces the Strategic Scientific Reserve and its goal to create the best army in the world. Steve starts training with the other soldiers, but not surprisingly, he is immediately behind all of them. In addition to this, his fellow trainees are making it even harder for him. However, he is dedicated and uses his wits instead of his physical strength. Colonel Phillips is already questioning Dr. Erskine about his decision to choose Steve to be the right person for his experiment. The colonel highly doubts it and puts the soldiers to the test by throwing a sham grenade amongst them. Everyone quickly takes cover except for Steve, who launches himself on the grenade in the hope of protecting his comrades. This only proves why the doctor chose him, and Colonel Phillips cannot argue with that. That night, Steve gets a visit from Dr. Erskine. He asks the doctor why he chose him. Dr. Erskine tells him about how he was recruited by Hitler to make his army strong, but he refused. They sent Johann Schmidt, who was a brilliant scientist at that time, after him. He took hold of the doctor's experimental formula and used it on himself to make him stronger. While it did make him stronger, it worsened his negative qualities, as Dr. Erskine had not yet been able to perfect the serum. Dr. Erskine tells Steve that he chose him because a strong man might not remember how to respect power, but a weak man like Steve knows how to value strength and knows compassion. Steve and Agent Carter head to the secret lab facility of the military. Hidden inside an antique shop in Brooklyn, Steve will finally undergo the experiment. He lays down on the machinery, feeling a little nervous. Dr. Erskine facilitates the experiment. The superhuman serum is infused in Steve, and he is enclosed in a metal chamber created by Howard Stark to complete the transformation. The procedure begins, and at 70% power, Steve is already screaming in agony. This immediately worries everyone in the room, especially Dr. Erskine and Agent Carter. They instruct Howard Stark to stop the machine, but Steve tells them to keep going. He emerges from the chamber with an incredible physique. It is a sign that the experiment was successful. Everyone is delighted with the success of the experiment, but their celebration is short-lived when an assassin hired by Schmidt manages to infiltrate the facility and blow up a bomb. He steals the remaining serum and shoots Dr. Erskine twice, ultimately ending his life. The assassin escapes the building and gets a hold of a taxi. Steve runs after him, showcasing his new incredible speed and other superhuman abilities, until he catches up to the taxi. The assassin exits the vehicle and takes a hostage with him. He throws the child into the sea, giving him time to escape in a high-tech water vehicle. This does not stop Steve, however, and he swims after the assassin. He breaks the vehicle, causing it to flood, and takes the man back to the surface. Steve throws him to the ground, and the serum breaks upon impact. He tries confronting him, but the assassin uses a cyanide capsule to end his life, proclaiming the words, "Hail Hydra." Steve is devastated after what happened to the doctor. The military has no other choice but to try and reverse engineer the formula from Steve's DNA. Stark is investigating the water vehicle the assassin used to escape, and connects it to Schmidt and the Nazis. The military decides to send Agent Carter with other personnel on a mission to investigate. Steve wants to be a part of it, but they think that it is better for him to inspire people in the midst of war. He tours the country as Captain America, bringing hope to the people during the time of war. He wears a costume in the colors of the U.S. flag and gives speeches about hope and the war on different stages across the country, accompanied by a lot of beautiful performers. The citizens, especially the children, love him, buying merchandise that has Captain America on it, getting his autograph, and taking pictures with him. He is given a chance to shoot propaganda videos that are shown across the country to inspire the people. His next performance is in Italy, near the war front, in November 1943. Steve does not expect the cold welcome of the soldiers towards him. He is so accustomed to people loving him that he delivers his speech awkwardly and obliges to the demands of the soldiers to bring back the beautiful performers once more. Steve and Agent Carter meet again, and she tells him that he is meant to be more than just a silly performer or a lab experiment. She informs him about what happened to the troops sent out to fight against Schmidt. Only a few returned of the 107th Squad. After hearing this, Steve quickly asks Colonel Phillips what happened to Bucky, as he is part of the 107th Squad. Colonel Phillips informs him that Bucky was not able to return. This devastates him deeply, as Bucky is his best friend. He asks the colonel if they are planning on a rescue mission. The colonel explains that winning the war is what matters the most, because they can rescue all the other soldiers if they win. Steve asks him why not just go to the location and rescue the remaining soldiers. However, the enemy territory is heavily fortified, and the risk will outweigh the benefit. Hearing this, Steve makes up his mind to take matters into his own hands. He prepares himself to face Schmidt and his army by himself. Agent Carter tries talking him out of it, but after realizing that he is not going to back down, she decides to come with him. She brings Howard Stark along as their pilot. The plan is to get Steve as close as possible to enemy territory. Agent Carter gives him a transponder in order for them to find him. Their plane immediately starts to get shot down as soon as they enter the perimeter. Steve tells his comrades to turn around before jumping out of the plane. Steve finds Schmidt's base deep in the woods and climbs up a truck entering the facility. He infiltrates the facility and sees the weapons powered by the Tesseract, taking one. He finds his way to the prison cells and frees all the prisoners. They inform him that there is an isolation ward in the factory, and that might be where Bucky is. The prisoners wreak havoc as Steve looks for Bucky. Schmidt sees them coming through the CCTV and decides to blow up the facility. Steve finally finds Bucky strapped into a laboratory bed. He helps him up and hears a loud sound, realizing that Schmidt is planning to do something drastic. The facility blows up section by section as Steve and Bucky try to escape. They encounter Schmidt and Dr. Zola. Schmidt mocks Steve about Dr. Erskine's success in perfecting the serum, and they fight above the fiery hell of the exploding facility. Dr. Zola separates the bridge as Schmidt reveals his real face, and the two of them escape. Back at the military base, Colonel Phillips believes that Steve has been taken out in enemy territory. Suddenly, there is a commotion at camp, as the missing men from the division come marching in, led by Steve. The soldiers at camp are delighted to see their comrade, and the colonel is in disbelief, but Steve finally earns his respect. Agent Carter is delighted to see him back alive. Bucky, together with their fellow soldiers, cheers for Steve's success in this rescue mission. A ceremony is held the next day for Captain America as a show of gratitude and reward. Steve does not show up, and instead spends his time working with Agent Carter and the military to track Schmidt's other facilities. Steve puts together his team to charge against Schmidt, consisting of the soldiers he successfully rescued. He also asks Bucky to join him. Meanwhile, Howard Stark is investigating the properties of the equipment powered by the Tesseract that the soldiers were able to get their hands on during the escape. He is in disbelief at how much power a tiny particle can hold. Steve meets with Howard Stark to see the gear for him and his team. Stark shows him his latest works that can aid them against the Russians. Steve becomes particularly interested in a prototype shield made from vibranium. For the next several days, Steve and his military team raid all known Hydra bases and take each one down to the ground. Their counterattack infuriates Schmidt as he watches his facilities go down in flames. Steve and the military's war efforts are all documented to bring hope to the citizens of the country. As they stand in the ashes and rubble of their former base, Schmidt conveys all of his anger and frustration to Dr. Zola, blaming him for his failure to stop Steve and his military allies. Dr. Zola explains that he is merely the creator of the weapons. He is not a fighter, and he cannot use what he creates. 3 of his soldiers arrive and report that their troops fought the best they could, but only the 3 of them remain. Schmidt believes that they did not fight well enough, since they still remain. He pulls out his gun and shoots the 3 remaining soldiers, ending their lives. Steve and the military forces are hidden in a snowy mountain range where a cable for travel ends. They get the information that Dr. Zola is riding the train, passing by the mountain range they are in. They think that the enemies need him badly, being in the hurried state they are in. Steve and his companions use the cable to glide down and get on top of the train. They enter the train without getting detected, but as they go further inside the train, the door between 2 cars suddenly closes, separating Steve and Bucky. The 2 of them do not have time to react to their situation, as both of them are attacked by 2 heavily armed soldiers. It turns out that Dr. Zola already knew that they would infiltrate the train, and had set up a trap for them. He orders the soldiers to take Steve and their enemies down through their communication system, while he stays safe in a different car. Steve manages to take down his enemy after exchanging fire. He takes the soldier's weapon and shoots down the door separating him and Bucky. Meanwhile, Bucky runs out of ammo. Steve gives him his gun and charges the other soldier as Bucky shoots him down. Bucky tells him that he got it already, but suddenly another soldier appears from behind them, and Steve has little time to react before the soldier blasts. Steve raises his shield in time. Bucky picks up his shield and shoots at the guard, but the guard manages to shoot off another blast. He climbs out the side of the train to reach Bucky, who is hanging for his dear life on the handrail. He reaches out to him, but the handrails break, and Bucky plummets down to his doom. At the same time, an Allied soldier reaches the control room where Dr. Zola and the train conductor are. They manage to arrest him, and he is put into an interrogation room, where Colonel Phillips offers him a steak. Dr. Zola refuses and tells him that he does not eat meat. The colonel sent a fake letter about Dr. Zola's cooperation to Washington. He is hoping that the enemies will decode the message, making Dr. Zola Schmidt a target. Dr. Zola still believes in Schmidt's capability, and when the colonel asks him what Schmidt is aiming for, he tells him that his target is everywhere. Schmidt is at an airport the next day with his elite soldiers, as he gives his speech about raining doom on their enemies. Agent Carter finds Steve at a destroyed tavern, drinking and mourning for the loss of his friend. She comforts him, saying that Bucky's sacrifice was because he believed in Steve. He is filled with hatred, swearing that he will not stop until all of Hydra is gone or captured. She assures him that he will not be alone in this battle. Colonel Phillips, Howard Stark, Steve, and the military personnel are planning their next move, based on the information they gathered from Dr. Zola. The next day, Steve charges in alone on his motorcycle, and is immediately pursued by more than a dozen enemy soldiers on motorcycles. He takes them all down and penetrates the fortress blocked by a tank. He fights every soldier he sees using his superhuman strength and wits. In the end, he is surrounded by the enemies and taken to Schmidt. Schmidt thinks that Steve is incredibly arrogant to march in on their base alone and expect to beat Hydra. He despises Steve because he thinks that Dr. Erskine did not give him what is rightfully his and gave it to a nobody instead. He punches Steve in frustration, knocking him to the ground. Steve taunts him that he could deal with him all day, but Schmidt ignores him and takes out his gun. Before he is able to shoot, however, Steve's allies manage to locate and shoot cables to where Schmidt is. This takes Schmidt by surprise, and he shoots Steve, but at the same time, 3 Allied soldiers break through the windows and start shooting down enemy soldiers. Schmidt flees the room, and Steve chases after him. The soldiers that infiltrated the base call in a report to the colonel, and he commands his soldiers to move. The ground soldiers exchange fire with the enemy team until they get pushed back deeper into the base. Schmidt enters a huge plane and powers it with the Tesseract. His target is in New York City. Before the plane can take off completely, Colonel and Agent Carter give Steve a ride to pursue the plane. When they reach the cliff, Steve jumps off and grabs a hold of its wheel. He is able to enter the plane and discovers a bomb bound to strike New York. He fights off the soldiers inside and takes control of the small fighter plane. Schmidt realizes that something is wrong with the small plane and starts firing at Steve. He crashes the small fighter plane into the engine and retrieves his shield. He finds the cockpit empty and Schmidt attempts to shoot him from behind, but Steve blocks him with his shield. The two of them fight one another as Schmidt continuously shoots him. Steve throws his shield at him, throwing him to where the Tesseract is. This breaks the machine holding the Tesseract, infuriating Schmidt even further. Schmidt tries to utilize the raw power of the Tesseract, but this obliterates him, leaving the Tesseract. This punches a hole into the plane, causing it to fall from the sky. Steve contacts his military allies. Agent Carter talks with him as he tells them that Schmidt is gone. She asks him what the situation of the plane is and his coordinates to find him a safe landing site. He tells her that there is not enough time and that the plane is heading for New York. He says that the best course of action is to crash it into the ocean to minimize the destruction it can cause. Agent Carter begs him to think it through, but he argues that it is his choice. Steve aims the plane down at the ocean, and as he descends, he tells her that they should reschedule their date. She agrees with him tearfully until their connection cuts off. The crashed plane sinks down the ice. The world celebrates the war ending, and the soldiers remember the bravery and sacrifice of Steve Rogers. Meanwhile, Howard Stark and his team look for the Tesseract at the bottom of the ocean. Steve wakes up in bed in a recovery room in New York City. A woman enters the room, and Steve knows that the place is not real. The woman gives a signal to her companions, and 2 soldiers enter the room. This aggravates Steve, and he beats the 2 soldiers before punching through the fake room. It turns out that he is in a set, like a bigger room. He runs out of the building and sees that everything is now modern. Nick Fury shows up with S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and surrounds Steve. Nick apologizes for the deception and tells Steve that he has been asleep for more than 70 years. This takes Steve by surprise, and he sadly remembers his date with Agent Carter. In the post-credits scene, Steve is boxing at a gym, taking out all his frustrations about the life he missed, until he breaks the punching bag. Nick arrives and tells him that he has a mission to save the world once again.